I wonder whether my pessimism is from the fact that freedom seems under threat internally and externally. First, internally, it seems we've swung from a love of freedom to a fear of it. There's a fear of free speech, for instance, a fear of individualism. Instead, we're now getting a new tribalism, new identity politics, race politics, censorship. You're being an attempt to censor you by the organisation representing psychiatrists in Canada, for instance, now. Increasing fear of freedom. Is that how you see it?
Well, again, it's a real dichotomy, isn't it? Because although my clinical license, for example, is under threat in Canada, the threat is illusory as well as real, because there isn't really anything the board of psychologists, the governing board of psychologists, can do to me that's going to stop me. And at the same time that my freedom to speak is curtailed, or attempts have been made to curtail it, I also have a platform of communication that's unparalleled in history. I don't mean me personally, I mean all of us, because we can communicate the way we're communicating right now across the world, and we can communicate with millions of other people. And so it's another reflection of this same dichotomy that's at least partly produced by accelerating technology, is that there are rapidly moving threats to freedom. We could easily turn into a surveillance state that would put what's being done in China to shame, where absolutely everything we did, every breath we take, would be monitored and controlled. And we have the technology to make that possible, and I think that's a real threat. Now, that doesn't mean it's inevitable. I think that people can decide that that's not the pathway that they want to walk down. Now, one relatively recent occurrence that might make you optimistic in a perverse manner is the fact that we did transform ourselves in the West into a totalitarian state for about 2 years. And we did that because we mimicked China, which was a very bad idea. And we did that because of the hypothetical threat of COVID, which was obviously massively overblown, but we rolled it back. And so what I would say about that is that it demonstrated that when push came to shove, people decided in favor of freedom and against restrictions, and that prevailed. And I see no reason why we couldn't continue to make the proper decisions as we move forward. Now, one of the things I've tried to do as I've toured around the world and written is also to inform people that the idea that we should pursue security and safety at the cost of freedom is an illusion, because I don't think there is any security and safety in life apart from what you might garner around yourself if you lived an honest and productive life. I think that we need to be more forthright, especially with young people, about the fact that life is an apocalyptic risk and always has been, but that the right attitude towards that isn't to hide yourself under your bed and cower and be triggered by every little occurrence that might upset you emotionally, but to face the world with some voluntary courage and find out as a consequence of doing that there's a lot more to you than you think. And this is certainly something therapists have discovered, real therapists, in the last 100 years, because we know perfectly well, and every therapist worth his or her salt knows this, that if you help people confront what they're afraid of and intimidated by programmatically and strategically and voluntarily, they get much braver and more competent. And that's the right pathway forward. And if you explain that to young people, I would say, and to older people for that matter, they're pretty damn excited about that possibility, because we're built for adventure and not for security. And if you can tell the right story of adventure, then it overwhelms the attractiveness of the story of security or the story of hedonistic gratification.
Well, golly, I think that message very much needs to be heard now, because what makes me worried more is at the same time that freedom is being under assault internally in the West, the censorship, etc., we see powerful countries that are authoritarian coming together in an alliance to challenge the West. You've got China, you've got Russia, Iran and North Korea. I mean, just last week, the Hamas terrorist group that attacked Israel sent a delegation to talk to Russia. Iran sent a delegation there too. You see them coming together. And meanwhile, in the West, you see protesters supporting the Hamas war on Israel. You had I don't know how many were in London just as you're gathering together for this conference, 100,000 or something, crowding the London Bridge, etc. It's just frightening. There's protests too against saving Ukraine from the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
It just seems to be a weaker commitment to freedom inside the West, just when it's being threatened by countries that are enemies of freedom.
Well, what we're seeing play out to some degree is the continued manifestation of the oppressor-oppressed narrative that's so characteristic of the totalitarian left. And in its latest guise, it's the Palestinians are playing the role of the unjustly oppressed. And once you accept that story, well, it's easy to get your back up about it, and there are reasons for that. But, I would say at the same time, a lot of the pretensions of the authoritarian left have been stripped away in the last month. Institutions like Harvard have taken what might be permanent stains on their reputation as a consequence of being a little bit too ideological in their approach. And then I would also say, you could also view the current conflict that's emerging in the Middle East as the last gasp of the totalitarian dictators, even in the Islamic world, because my sense is that, and I believe this to be the case, that Iran fueling Hamas did that out of desperation because they know that peace is about to break through with the Abraham Accords. And it isn't obvious to me that the countries that signed the Abraham Accords, making peace with Israel, are going to retreat from that, even in the face of these large-scale public demonstrations. I don't think Iran is going to be successful in its attempts to manipulate the Arab world back into permanent enmity with the Jews in Israel and with the Western world. Now, who knows, right? Because it's a dynamic and fluid situation, but I don't think there's any reason for despair. This could well be the last gasp of the brutal dictators. I'm not overwhelmingly, naively optimistic about that, but the Abraham Accords were a major step forward, and they're not dead yet. And so I'm hoping that countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia who would have signed the Abraham Accords if they would have been approached properly, let's say by the Biden administration 2 years ago, I think they may still be on board. I think that's possibly still salvageable. And so there's room for hope even on that side of the equation.